All right, welcome all. I'm here with Gabriel Kahane. Gabriel is a critically acclaimed singer, songwriter, and composer. He's a musician and storyteller and serves as the creative chair of the Oregon Symphony. His discography includes 5 LPs as a singer songwriter, including the self titled Gabriel Kahane in 2008, Where Are the Harms in 2011, The Ambassador in 2014, Book of Travelers in 2018, and Magnificent Bird in 2022. So I'm going to talk with Gabriel Kahane today about communication, culture, and society. I know he is a musician, but he has a lot of experiences reflecting on how art and the music fit into those broader views. So thanks for joining me.
Of course, my pleasure.
I think one of the things that's most fascinating to me about the your work in the public sphere is the digital fast
Ugh.
or internet
Yes.
hiatus, however you want to call it. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know you did it in 2016 and 2019. Is that the only time? Could you tell us how often you did that?
Yeah, so back in 2016, the morning after the presidential election, I got on a train and I traveled just under 9,000 miles around the continental US talking to strangers and dining cars of Amtrak trains. And I did this in part because I felt that I was expending a great deal of emotional and psychological energy resisting the impulse to sort of divide the country neatly into two warring factions, which I felt like was what was being sold to me both through legacy media and through digital media. And I'm just very much a believer in the idea that we are all one human cloth, we're all one human family, and that um, anything that we see that we find repellent, we're implicated in it in some way. Like none of us is innocent. There are no there are no angels. There are no demons. We're all angels and we're all demons. And we, like Walt Whitman said, I contain multitudes. We all contain multitudes. Um, so I wanted to kind of bypass uh media, the literal word media. I didn't only want my experience of America to be mediated in the aftermath of that election. So I got on the train and I spent 13 days having these extraordinary conversations with strangers. And at the very last minute before I left home, I was living in New York at the time. I decided to leave my phone at home. Uh, and that was a way of really sort of willing myself into conversation with people. There was no retreating into Twitter or Instagram or whatever. And halfway through the trip, I was somewhere in, I want to say I was we were in the desert in New Mexico, just gorgeous landscape. And I felt this kind of cleanse, this feeling of real transformation, some of which had to do with just, breaking bread with strangers. And some of it also had to do with, lost my phone for a week. And was sort of set this thought aside in that moment of, I should do this for more than 2 weeks. So then I was just offline for 2 weeks. 3 years later in 2019, I left the internet for a year completely. No email, no social media, no smartphone, no watching Pasti Rani's YouTube videos, or, cat videos. And I chose as the bookends for that the uh, election day 2019 and election day 2020, because I was curious to know what it would be like to observe and participate in the lead up to a presidential election that, in so many ways, was being conducted almost exclusively online from a place of being completely offline. And I had a lot of questions about the ways in which we as a society have become so conditioned to believe that convenience and efficiency are inherent goods without examining the debts that accrue. Just to give one example, um, when you can buy something with one click, you buy more things, and one sense of necessity changes. Uh, that which is convenient becomes necessary. And when we buy more things are manufactured, which is bad for the planet. So we have all this stuff kicking around that we don't really need. That's just one example. We could also talk about the impact on the body politic and the social sphere, that as we do, conduct more transactions online, we see less of each other. So it's not just that, some people argue that social media is polarizing. I would argue that actually, following the sociologist Chris Bale, who founded the polarization lab at Duke University, he argues through his research that social media creates the perception of polarization, but it actually doesn't polarize us. And if you look at the data on any sort of like hot button social and economic issue, we are no more polarized now than we were 40 years ago. It's just that social media draws out the most extreme voices and crowds out the sort of quiet middle. Um, so we can talk about the impact of social media on polarization and the sort of fracturing of the body politic, but we can also just look at the fact that if I don't go to the store to buy a pair of shoes, that's a social interaction that I'm not having. If I don't, ask someone for directions to a bakery, but instead look at my phone, that's another social interaction that I'm not having. So I wanted, through this year of being offline, to see what it would feel like to return to all of those face-to-face human interactions. And then 4 months into my experiment, I flew in March of 2020 to Portland, Oregon for what was supposed to be 1 week. Pandemic hit, everything shut down. And I found myself not only offline, but 2,500 miles away from my friends and in the middle of a pandemic. And so the experiment became something very, very different than what I'd intended. It became quite monastic and internal.
I read in your article that, well, I'll say a little bit about, 2016 for me was a turning point in my social media too, because I felt like, because I had a Facebook, and I felt like I could not have nuanced conversations with anybody on that platform.
Yeah.
And I remember you writing about that. The other thing I remember you writing about was um sort of the fact that most people will tend to ask you what was most challenging. And I think that's sort of a go-to question, but that was interesting because it's not the question that comes to my mind immediately. The question I want to ask you is, what did you learn about being human?
Hmm. Hmm. That's such a good question. I've never been asked that question. Uh, well, it's really hard to disentangle the being offline from it being this once in a century global phenomenon of a pandemic that, we hadn't had in that skin since 1918, almost exactly a century earlier. Uh, it's also really hard for you to disentangle it from the fact that I was the father of a young child, that I had just moved coasts, that I knew almost no one. Um, I did a lot of thinking about my work as an artist. Just before the pandemic, I had been at a kind of career apex. I had scored a play on Broadway. I had been touring with some really wonderful artists. I was going to play in beautiful concert halls in Europe and in the UK and in the United States. And there was one experience in particular, and this kind of goes back to this thing about efficiency and convenience. Uh, there's a great singer-songwriter originally from Chicago, Andrew Bird, violinist and singer, and I had made these orchestrations of some songs of his that we were doing with the LA Philharmonic and the National Symphony in DC, or Kansas City Symphony. And at the same time, I was writing this score for this play on Broadway. And we were in tech for this play, and we had a concert in the middle of tech for this Andrew Bird project in Kansas City. And so there was only one flight that I could take to get back to New York in time for the tech rehearsal to start. And this is 2019. And I remember, you know, getting up at 4:30 in the morning to catch this 6 a.m. flight, feeling like garbage, getting on plane, taxi, through Midtown Manhattan, wheeling my suitcase up the aisle of this Broadway theater, and feeling like truly horrible in my body. And at the same time, I was like, ah, I've made it. Like the fact that I'm suffering means that I'm doing something right. And I remember meditating on that during the pandemic when all of it went away and thinking, what terrible way to live. And why would you organize your life in a way where your suffering is sort of equated with success? And so I think from that place of solitude, I started to think really deeply about what really nourishes me as an artist, which relates to your question about what I learned about being human. And I think what I came to understand is that in the culture at large, whether it's through algorithms or glossy magazines, we're sold this idea that doing things at scale, doing things for many, many people, communicating to many, many people at once will make you happy. And yet, for me at least, the experiences in my art making that I hold on to and that really make me want to do more of it are the most intimate ones. They're the ones where someone, sends me an email and it's like, I was getting sober and my wife was being treated for cancer and I sat in her hospital room and I listened to your album and I just weep and I think, oh, I reached one person. And that, like, that was a mitzvah. Like, that was a good thing. Or I got a wedding invitation from two fans that their first date had been hearing the Clay concert in, I think, Madison, Wisconsin. And I played a song called Little Love to open that set. And they said, we were on our first date. We held hands during that song. And now we're going to walk down the aisle to that song. And those are the things where it's like, oh, art exists in service of community and in service of the social. And yet it's so easy, particularly with, the era of social media, to think that, going viral will make you happy. But the problem is that going viral is just a number and it's not human. And so if you reach 100,000 people, you feel good for 15 seconds, 30 seconds, an hour. And then, well, now I have to reach a million people. And then you have to reach 10 million people. And then you have to reach 100 million people. But none of it will make you happier because it is divorced from the human experience. And similarly, when it comes to live performance, I think some of the happiest times I've had on stage have been playing for 50 people or 100 people, not 2,000 people. And often it's because they're the people who most wanted to be in the room. So I think, to sort of loop back to the question about what did I learn about being human, I think it's also hard for me to separate what I continue to be learning in the long tail of that. It's now 5-6 years ago. I think I'm just really preoccupied this question of how do we transform our society to one in which we love each other better and treat each other better. And rather than pointing at something that we disagree with and saying like, that's bad, to ask the question, well, why does that person believe that thing? And what led them to believe that? Because, I think we're in this moment where there's this oligarchic class that has more wealth than, percentage wise, anyone has had since the last Gilded Age. And on both, there's a mirror politically where both the populist right and the populist left are looking at the same problem, which is the concentration of wealth in the hands of like 5 dudes.
Yeah.
And we come to different conclusions about why this is the case, and we blame other people. And we're so close to figuring it out, of realizing that like we are not each other's enemies. The enemy is a society structured in such a way that allows people to hold that much wealth and extract that much wealth from society. And so I want to be a participant in creating a society where we can grant each other more grace toward building the solidarity that's necessary to not have us all ultimately like enslaved by Elon Musk, which is what we're heading toward.
Yeah, I think you and I share a lot of the similar concerns in thinking. I've advocated for grace. I've used that exact word for
Mm.
years now, and I think we have an audience of young people here with us, and they're, they know no other world than the digital world that I grew up with, and you and I are close in age, and I think we have the benefit of having grown up with an analog childhood and a digital goal,
Yeah.
and there's something about straddling that.
Yes.
Knowing,
I think about that a lot.
I think that's interesting. Um,
Mm.
you set me up really well for the next question, but before I do, I just wanted to sort of add a little footnote that your little love song also hit hard with me. I really, uh, I ended up that YouTube has a little year in review, and it ended up being your video was done.
Oh,
But would you sort of set us up to talk about more was this article that you wrote in 2022 called Social Media and Its Discontents on your Substack.
okay.
And one of the things that you wrote in there that's really, I thought, stood out to me was you wrote, the essence of my work as an artist, I've come to realize, is in trying to understand human experience that's different than my own, to find empathy and compassion for those whose lives may seem at first blush totally unrelatable. And you're connecting this to your work as an artist
Yeah.
too. So this is something I care about as in the work that I do, and I wanted to see how that what does that look like as a musician, if it could maybe say a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for me to separate talking about it as a musician versus talking about it as a citizen because it is kind of it's a political project. It's a project having to do with solidarity. Uh, I recently read there's this classic of sociology, Bowling Alone by Dr. Putnam, just published back in 2000. And the premise of that book is that he observed through looking at a lot of data that over the course of the second half of the 20th century, social capital, by which means uptake in clubs, religious organizations, trade unions, formal and informal socializing, bully weeks, bridge leagues, book clubs, just cratered, starting in the late 50s through the end of the 20th century. And I think we continue to live in a moment in which social capital is severely diminished. And one thing that I actually sort of find comforting about the book is that this phenomenon began long before the internet. It's not the internet's fault. Um, so when we talk about being, members of this generation that's on the cusp, I don't take the position of like, oh, it's all the internet's fault. And the internet is amazing. The internet has enabled me to do incredible things. Like my last album, Magnificent Bird, I made that with 17 musicians during the pandemic on 3 continents. No one was ever in the same room. And that's thanks to technology. So God bless.
Yeah.
What I do think where it gets dangerous is when you start broadcasting to an invisible and undefined audience at scale. That's where the things get really tricky. But going back to this question about the experience of those unlike myself, and back to Robert Putnam's book, there's sort of 3 main things that he identifies as the culprits for this collapse of social capital. The first is television, and that leisure time became privatized because of television. That before television, people socialized together uh, in person. Uh, they had dinner parties. They played music together, punk, and then television privatizes leisure time. The second was urban sprawl, where people had longer commutes and had less time to volunteer, to be in a cloud, and so on and so forth. And related to sprawl is that people started to self-sort into homogenous neighborhoods that lacked difference. And one of the things that he observes is that today we have what he would call a lot of symbolic affinity, which is to say that, you know, many of us probably follow accounts on social media that align with our, a particular political belief, um, which could be that, like, cats should rule the world. Let's say we, seven of us in this room, we're all very much on board with this idea that, like, cats should, a cat should be the next president. Um, and that's symbolic affinity. It is not something that's rooted in our physical lives. It's symbolic. It's like, I believe this. Oh, you also believe in cats building the world, as opposed to the affinity that comes from a physical social network. And Putnam in his research finds that communities, the more diverse a community, the more socially engaged they are, because they have more disagreements to work out. So they have this thing in common, which is like, you are my neighbor. And I experienced this in my own neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, where my next door neighbors, we are very close to. We carpool with their son, who's about my daughter's age. Um, we have shared interest in like the potholes on our street not being fixed, because if they were fixed, people would drive faster, and we don't want them to drive faster because we want our kids to be safe while playing. Um, but I know that there are some, like, pretty intense political things on which we disagree, and it does not prevent us from uh, trusting each other with our children's lives, to take them to school. And I think that that kind of social capital relates to this thing of empathizing with people whose lives are different. That is was virtually impossible to do online, because it is flattened. The experience of a human life is flattened, whether because the person is invisible because it's just text on a, text-based social media platform, or even in the context of a video-based platform, you get 90 seconds of someone talking to a camera, but that's not a life. That's not really a human being. Um, so I guess in the intersection of citizenship and art making, I'm thinking about, what do we do to prepare social capital? And that begins, I think, with having a curiosity about lives that are different than one's own, and to have the humility to not be sure that we're right about everything, and to acknowledge the possibility that the person who believes X on issue Y while we believe Z, that they have a reason for believing what they believe, and that there may be things, where we do agree. So I think that's, it is, I guess, as I wrote in that essay a couple of years ago, it's a project of empathy for the sake of empathy, because I think that's, if you want to put a religious gloss on it, um, I'm Jewish, but Christianity teaches us, I mean, and Judaism also teaches us that we should try to love each other the way that God loves man. That's the ultimate. That was Martin Luther King's idea of the beloved community. That the reason we love our enemy is because God loves our enemy, and we live in a largely loveless society. So I think that the work of making a better society lives in having the grace and the humility and the discipline to love each other better.
You your thoughts on that uh, mirror mine very closely. I share with you the same similar concerns that take about, for example, when you grow up with a digital childhood and you, especially the child, and you're trying to learn how to, the awkwardness of building your social networks as a teen, love life, friendships, and then conflicts are inevitable human experience. But in the digital world, it's just all you need to do is, I have a conflict with this person, block,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
I don't have to go through the difficulty of actually, I have to figure this out right in the face to face. And I think that's one thing that's shaping the way that the world that we live in now, I think. And it has implications for how we have communication across their differences once we reach adulthood. And so I just want to strongly sort of amplify the point that we need to get offline and have good faith
their conversations across.
I would say it's not just blocking. It's also like saying horrible things to each other online, behind from the comfort of being behind a phone. My friend Ben Folds, the singer-songwriter, told me an incredible story about his kid's school. I think maybe this was during the pandemic. It got back to the teacher that these two kids were saying like absolutely horrific things to each other via DM over some platform or other. And she somehow got a transcript of what they had said to each other. And she printed it out and she asked them to go to the front of the class and to basically read the script of what they had written about each other. And they did it and they were just sobbing because they couldn't believe that they were performing this kind of cruelty to each other that they never would have done if they were face to face.
Wow.
And it solved the problem.
Yeah. That's an amazing
experience. I love that story.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you about, so I attended your Veil series performance last semester, and one of the things you said in the middle of the show, really, this is one of the reasons I really wanted to talk with you. I thought it was so interesting. You said something, I quote here, "I mess up things all the time. I'll level with you that I actually feel that my job is less about perfection and more about trying to animate community in a room. And if we feel like we're holding space together and being with each other, that's actually my job. The singing and the playing is sort of secondary." And then you go on to how you can be human with each other, get to know each other. And this is already connected to some of the threads of peas, but I would consider this sort of an articulation of your performance philosophy in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you come to develop his philosophy?
Well, I want to have a little meta moment, which is that I really want to be looking at all of you. And yet I feel like the sort of premise of the podcast is that you're in profile talking to the person who's interviewing you. But in terms of building community, it feels very not community oriented to have my face where it's like, I want to. So, you know what? I'm just going to say, I'm just going to look at all of you because it feels weird not to. This is because like when you get into the performing arts, you're told basically don't ever look into the camera. So I can just not look into the camera this way. I think that sometime during the pandemic, when I was thinking about what I missed about live performance, I thought about like what are the spaces in which I most love to perform. There's a now sadly defunct club in New York called Rockwood Music Halls, which just went out of business about a year ago. And from the time that I was coming up around 2005, that became, I would play at Carnegie Halls, but where I really loved was Rockwood Music Hall. It fit about 160, 170 people, mostly stand down. Bartenders, cocktail waitresses moving around the room, serving drinks. It was never totally quiet, but it would get pretty quiet. And one of the things I loved, just to speak about the idea of silence, there's this idea of like reverence for art and we have to be quiet in a room. One of the things I loved about playing a club is the inherent tension of like, there's a bartender shaking a martini, and it's going to make noise. You might be at the quietest part of the song, but that's life. Like we're just all in a room together. And I think that's so beautiful. And that when you can get a room that is also a social space to have 170 people shut up and listen, that feels magical in a way that it does not when you're in a concert hall where the expectations that everyone sits very quietly with their fingers threaded. So I was thinking during the pandemic of like, why do I do what I do? And I just had this revelation of like, it's not about me. I'm a shepherd of communal experience. And therefore, yeah, it's important that I strive as an artist to develop my craft further, to become a better singer, to become a better songwriter, to become a better pianist and guitar player. But the craft that I'm most interested in is how do I help the people in the room to see each other better. Um, and maybe that's particular to this moment, and also just to have a good time. I was saying to someone earlier that, you know, Western classical music is one of the only music uh, cultures in which the social dimension is completely divorced from the musical dimension.
Mm.
That it can be this very sort of like anesthetized thing where, you know, you walk into the concert hall and you're quiet and you only clap on you don't clap between movements and nobody talks to each other. You compare that to like bluegrass. Like bluegrass is it to me, you know, bluegrass is kind of an American uh it is an American music, and it can be an incredibly virtuosic music. Like a bluegrass band can be as virtuose as a string quartet. It's just different music. But when a bluegrass band plays, it is inherently social. And one of my really dear friends, Chris Dealey, a mandolin player from Punch Brothers, who I spent a lot of time on tour with, he's a, you know, object lesson in that. He's probably the greatest living mandolin player, but he's also first and foremost an entertainer. And when he goes out with his band, he wants people to have a good time. And so I guess this thing about perfectionism, I think I am a perfectionist when it comes to wanting to create a space in which people can really connect with each other. But like if I play a wrong note or forget a lyric or sing out of tune, you know, I'm going to forgive myself for that.
I found those people don't notice anyhow.
Yeah, most of the time.
But unless you're really, you know,
Really got to.
a technician.
Oh, yes, yes.
So yeah. Um, and uh, related to that, his my observation, and which I mentioned to you briefly before we started today, is your state banner, in my estimation, is really great, and I think part of that is the storytelling. So as you sort of developed your craft, what have you learned about storytelling, and maybe even to the effect that you incorporate it between your performance and songs and whatnot?
Yeah, well, I think all live performance is a kind of theater. And that's, I think, another thing that classical music often gets wrong is all performance is theater, and classical music just tends to be really bad theater. You know, it's like everyone's sitting at a music stand and pretending like we're not humans next to each other. So I also, you know, I trained as an actor when I was a kid, did a lot of theater. I write for the theater. So I think part of what you're picking up on is that um, even if I'm not doing a narrative thing with song, I'm still thinking of it as a kind of theatrical experience. I think the concert that you referred to, I walked in and there were a bunch of students sitting really far away. There were a bunch of empty seats up close. And one of the first things I did when I got on stage is I said, we're going to do some social engineering and you're going to all move down. And they thought there was like nervous laughter. And I said, no, 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 I'm serious. You're going to move down. And that's an act of theater. That's an act of spectacle. It's an act of like, we're here together. We're human beings and we're going to be in the same room.
Let's get more into it.
I think that, you know, my love of storytelling, I think maybe comes partly out of a little bit out of like Jewishness. Like I feel like storytelling and Judaism is that's like a thing. My father's a classical musician, and one of the ways that classical musicians socialize is by telling each other stories after concerts. And I think there's another element of it, which is the relationship between being a songwriter and stand-up comedy in terms of how you refine your banter, which is that if you're lucky enough to play, you know, 7 nights out of 10 nights, you are constantly tweaking how something lands, how something resonates with the audience, and realize that, oh, actually, I need to let this idea marinate with the audience a little longer so they can start to complete the thought, and then I move on to the next thing. And I also think a lot about the structure of stories. Um, there's the fiction writer Ayad Akhtar and playwright. He talks about how in neuroscience has determined that humans tend to process information in 90-second to 2-minute packets. And so thinking like actually sometimes like setting a watch. And if a story is 8 minutes long, but trying to make sure that the packets of information comport with how we process information. And I have a sip of water as my throat gets really craggy. I also want to just point out that we're getting close to the Q&A time.
That's exactly what I was a bit getting ready to transition to. And so I think it's a good time to move to your questions. Really don't feel constrained by anything that I've asked. You can ask whatever you want. But if you could please come up to this chair here. There's a mic. If you could put just hold the mic up so that you're
I think we have a taker. For those of you listening on the radio, we got a young man in a black hoodie coming up to ask a question.
So I can just speak like this.
yeah, but hold the mic up.
Hold the mic up. All right. Okay, so when you were talking, you talked a little bit about like a loveless society. I just wanted to like see if you had any more words on that, or like kind of why that is. Is that due to media, or is that just kind of just the way the world has turned?
I'm going to turn it back to you, and I'm going to ask you, do you think we live in a loveless society?
I don't think so, personally.
You don't?
Not completely.
Tell
I
me.
think there's some relations that you can have where love is still definitely there. Specifically like with partners and all that. I do agree that the way we're moving is more towards everyone kind of just focusing on themselves and not considering other people and not putting other people before them. I think it's still possible. I do agree that it is moving in that direction in a sense, but
Yeah, when I describe a loveless society, I don't mean one that's devoid of romantic love. I love my wife. I love my children. I love my family. I think it's really about how we love beyond the family unit and beyond the romantic unit. Something that I've been really preoccupied with for the last little while. During the pandemic, I started reading a lot of Martin Luther King's sermons, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. But in his conception of the beloved community, part of what we're trying to do is constructing a society where there are no in-groups and out-groups, where our sense of community is not, we define ourselves by what we're against. So much of society right now is like, I am against whatever they're for, and I'm for whatever they are against. And studying that time of like the 1960s civil rights movement, one of the things that became clear to me is that love, not romantic love, but like platonic love, Christian love, agape, was a disciplining force in the civil rights movement. It was the thing that kept people behaving in dignified ways in the face of indignity, because they understood that to give in to hate, given to hating their enemies, their neighbor enemy, was to diminish themselves. That we are corrupted by hate. And so that's kind of the way that I try to live my life. What I was just having a conversation the other day with another composer about the question of whether evil exists. And this is something I really wrestle with, because I think that, again, it sounds kind of hallmarky and cheesy, but I really do believe that we're all, in some sense, we're all connected, and therefore we're all implicated in both the best and the worst of humanity. So the people who I find the most repellent, who I think are the closest to what I would define as being evil, I still think that there is possibly, very, very difficult to actually execute, but a responsibility to try to love our enemies, even when they seem to exhibit the most, reprehensible qualities. So that's kind of what I mean when I talk about the loveless society. Thanks for the question.
Hi. my question is like, now that we're in like a post-COVID era, well, a couple years past the pandemic when we were all shut down, you mentioned that like there was like sort of a loss of community, especially with our current digital age. Do you have any advice for us on building communities, especially with our like major shift towards being more digital and also like the divide between groups,
Yeah.
especially with politics and
I
stuff?
mean, that's such a that really feels like that is the question. I mean, actually, these two questions are kind of very interlocking, and they're the big questions of our time. And I think that one thing to do is sounds really silly, but like start a club. One of the things I found really fascinating in this Robert Putnam book that I mentioned earlier, Bowling Alone, is the ways in which in the 1920s women's reading groups like book clubs became huge sources and locuses of political activity. That people would get together to read novels, but they actually also became like organizers through that work. And you can also think about like a choir. You can sing with people who believe totally different things than you believe, but you come together to sing. I think that the way to do it is by doing it, you know. I also think that, I really struggle with phone addiction. It was really easy for me to be completely offline. Like, this is the weird thing, is that being totally away from my phone for a year was no problem. But it's the doing it in moderation for me is like, it's impossible. And so I think that well, it's not impossible. I got this thing called the Brick, which some of you may have heard of. Amazing, life-changing for me. Where you can, lock yourself out of the bad apps. But I do think one thing that I really love, and I know this is hard as higher education is moving more and more to being digital, even if you don't do this with your computer, but what I have loved to do for years is to just actually turn off my phone before I go to sleep and try to have as many hours go by as possible before I turn it on, so that there is some brain space that you wake up into that is not corrupted by notifications and whatever. And it might be that while you're in college, that maybe that's like 2 hours or even 1 hour. And then you sort of like train yourself to have it become more and more and more. But I mention that just because I think that there is this relationship between investing in physical IRL community and weaning yourself off of devices. But I want to say something like, to be a little bit optimistic. I feel like almost every conversation I have these days, we all feel like the shit doesn't make us feel good. It makes us feel terrible. And I think that we are at a sort of like a breaking point where it's like, okay, enough of this. Let's move to the next thing. So I think my advice is like, turn off your phone as much as you can and talk to people, even when it feels scary. Find a thing that you love to do with people and build a group, whatever it is, like basket weaving or, Magic the Gathering or whatever.
Thank you.
Answer to the question.
So we're coming very close to the end. I just want to ask one final thing, which is a flip of the script. In other words, do you have any questions for us, for either?
Well, I have so many questions, but you all probably have places to go. I mean, my big question is like, what, as young people who are inheriting a world that is in the midst of what the economist Adam Tooze calls the poly crisis, like all of these overlapping things of war and famine and climate crisis and the, possible collapse of democracy. It's not really fair that this is what you're coming of age into. And I'm curious to know how you think about that and how you kind of achieve sanity and mental health growing up in a world that feels in a lot of ways broken. And I ask that in part because I'm a parent. I have two daughters, 7 and 4, and I'm thinking about they're still like, they're young enough that they have no idea how bad it's our world. And that's going to change. Like for my older kid, that's like going to start changing in the next year or two. So I'm curious to know, as young adults, like how do you think about that?
I think sometimes in our space as young adults, sometimes it can be overwhelming, and that kind of being in the mentality of that sometimes things are out of your reach and you can't control. And I think the best thing is to focus on things that you are in reach of, which I think is your body or wellness. And I think also just like simply just going outside. You're from Portland, Oregon. You guys have beautiful natures. We should all walking out in nature, going for walks, breathing in real air.
Yeah.
Even taking your shoes out, walking around, like it just feels good to like actually like do that and sightsee.
I do think your point on community definitely holds true here for us. And at Denison, we're all right here to find a community. It's a small school, but within that and within our generation, I feel like the vast majority of people our age have found communities, whether it be um, due to like a political topic they agree on and like an advocacy group, or just like a social community. And I think that online has even contributed to that too as well. And there might be some dangers in that, but I do think that has you know just increased our mental health and like awareness and just being surrounded by people with um views, but also that you can have conversations with.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for joining. I think your question is something we all can put a pen in and discuss it in our next class. And if you want to report back, I'm happy to share that through you. So through some.
My follow-up question is, do you feel angry at your parents' generation for having broken the world so much? I see some nodding and I see both nodding and shaking of the head. That's so interesting. Well, next time. Thanks so much for hanging out.
Yeah. Thank you.